If you dare to explore the darkest mysteries, subscribe now to Ghost Whispers. Activate notifications and be prepared to hear whispers that may haunt you even in the silence of the night. Real stories, mysterious events, and spine-chilling tales. But beware, fear will always be your companion here. Click the subscribe button before it's too late. The intruder behind the Christmas tree. I was about 6 years old when this happened, and I remember it vividly because it was the first Christmas I was allowed to stay up late enough to try and catch Santa. I woke up in the middle of the night, groggy and disoriented, but the glowing lights of the Christmas tree in the living room pulled me out of bed. Our house was always quiet at night, but as I shuffled down the hallway, something felt off. There was this weird stillness, like the air itself was holding its breath. I told myself I was just excited and nervous. It was Christmas Eve, after all. When I turned the corner to the living room, I froze. At first, I thought I was imagining things, but as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I saw a man crouched behind our Christmas tree. He wasn't moving, just hunched there, like he was trying to blend in with the shadows. He wasn't dressed like Santa or anything festive. He was wearing dark clothes, and I remember noticing how pale his hands looked as they gripped the edge of the tree stand. For a few seconds, I just stood there, staring at him, and I swear he was staring back at me through the branches. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. My brain kept trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was Dad checking the presents, or maybe I was dreaming. But then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. One of the lower ornaments on the tree was swaying, like it had just been bumped, and I could hear this faint sound of heavy breathing. That's when I realized this man wasn't supposed to be there. My chest felt tight, like I couldn't get a full breath, and my legs started shaking. I wanted to scream, but I was so scared that no sound came out. I just stood there, clutching the hallway wall, trying to will myself to move. Then he shifted. It was just a slight movement, but it was enough for me to see his face through the branches. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and locked onto me. He didn't look scared or angry, just calm, like he was waiting to see what I would do. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt, and I finally managed to take a step back, but the floor creaked under my foot. The sound seemed to snap him out of whatever trance he was in. He ducked lower behind the tree, like he was trying to hide again. That's when I finally found my voice and screamed as loud as I could. My scream brought everything to life. I heard my parents' bedroom door fly open, and my dad's heavy footsteps pounding down the hallway. The man didn't wait. He bolted. I saw him dart out from behind the tree and head straight for the kitchen, where the window above the sink was smashed open. It was the first time I noticed the cold, icy draft sweeping through the room. My mom was yelling behind me, asking what was going on, but I couldn't answer. I was frozen, staring at the jagged glass around the window frame and the man's silhouette disappearing into the darkness outside. When Dad turned on the lights, it was chaos. There were pine needles and broken ornaments all over the floor, and the gifts under the tree had been shoved around like he'd been looking for something. But nothing was missing. Not a single present, not even the wallet my dad had left on the counter. My parents checked every room in the house, but it was clear the man was gone. They called the police, who arrived quickly and asked me to describe what I'd seen. I told them everything I could. His dark clothes, his pale hands, and those wide, eerie eyes. But I'll never forget how one of the officers turned to my dad and said, "We've been getting a few calls like this tonight. Same MO. Broken window, nothing stolen." The rest of the night was a blur. The police stayed for a while, checking the yard and the broken window, but they didn't find much, just a few footprints in the snow leading toward the street. They said it looked like the guy had been wearing old boots, but the prints stopped halfway down the block, like he'd gotten into a car or something. My parents tried to reassure me, saying it was probably just a desperate burglar who panicked when he saw me. But that didn't explain why he didn't take anything, or why he was just sitting there, waiting behind the tree. Even as a kid, I could tell my parents didn't really believe what they were saying. They were just as freaked out as I was. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. My dad boarded up the window while my mom stayed with me, but I couldn't shake the image of that man's face, those blank, staring eyes watching me through the branches. The police didn't find him, and eventually, they left, saying to call if we noticed anything else unusual. For weeks after that, I couldn't go near the tree without feeling sick to my stomach. I begged my parents to take it down early, but they refused, saying we couldn't let fear ruin Christmas. I tried to act normal, but every time I walked past the living room, I felt like someone was watching me. The weirdest part came a few days later. My dad was cleaning up the broken glass around the window when he found something lodged in the windowsill, a scrap of fabric torn and stuck on a shard of glass. It was thick and dark, almost like burlap, but none of us recognized it. It didn't match any of our belongings or anything the police mentioned. My parents thought it might have been from the man's clothes, but they didn't seem too interested in figuring it out. They just wanted to move on, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. Why would someone wear something like that on a freezing winter night? And why did he break into our house only to hide behind the tree? Even now, years later, I still can't explain what happened. I've heard of burglars breaking in, but they don't just sit there and watch kids in the dark. There's a part of me that wonders if he was even planning to steal anything at all. Maybe he just wanted to scare us, or worse. I've tried to tell myself it was just some weird coincidence, that he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. But whenever Christmas rolls around and I see a tree lit up in someone's window, I can't help but feel a little on edge. I'll never forget the way he looked at me, so calm and unblinking, like he wasn't afraid of being caught. Like he didn't care. To this day, I still think about that night, especially when the holidays come around. My parents eventually moved out of that house, and we never had another incident like it. But the memory of that man lurking behind the tree never left me. Sometimes, late at night, I wonder what he was really doing there. Was he waiting for the right moment to do something? Or was he just some disturbed person who enjoyed hiding in plain sight? The police never found him, and no one ever figured out who he was or why he picked our house. That's the part that still gets me, not knowing. The scariest thing? He didn't need to take anything to leave a lasting mark. Every now and then, I'll catch myself glancing at windows or double-checking locks, even though I know it's been years. It's like a part of me still expects to see those pale hands and wide eyes staring back at me through the glass. I've told this story to friends before, and they always ask the same question. What would have happened if I hadn't screamed? Honestly, I try not to think about it. Whatever his intentions were, I'm just grateful he left that night. But some nights, when everything's quiet, I still feel like I'm holding my breath, waiting for something to move in the shadows again. Stalked after Christmas shopping. It started as a completely normal day. I had taken the day off to finish my Christmas shopping at the mall because weekends had been insane. I got there early, parked in one of those massive underground garages, and spent hours weaving through crowds and ticking off items on my list. By the time I left, it was late afternoon, and the air had that damp chill you only get in December. My car was in a far corner of the lot, and as I walked toward it, I felt this weird, prickly sensation at the back of my neck, like someone was watching me. I laughed it off. Who wouldn't feel uneasy in a half-empty parking lot? Still, I walked faster, clutching my bags tighter. Once I was inside the car, I locked the doors immediately, like I always do, and tried to shake off the nerves. The first call came just as I pulled into my driveway, bags still sitting on the passenger seat. I didn't recognize the number, but I answered out of habit, thinking it might be someone from work. There was silence at first, and I thought maybe it was a wrong number. But then I heard this voice, low and almost playful. He said, "You looked so pretty today at the mall." My stomach dropped. I thought it was a prank, so I snapped, "Who is this?" and hung up. My hands were shaking as I carried everything inside, trying to convince myself it was just some creep messing around. But 5 minutes later, my phone buzzed again. Same number. I didn't answer this time. Instead, I turned my phone to silent and tried to focus on unpacking my bags. I kept telling myself it was nothing, but I couldn't stop glancing at the windows. I was halfway through wrapping some gifts when the phone buzzed again, even though I'd set it to silent. This time, he left a voicemail. I didn't want to listen, but my curiosity got the better of me. His tone was still casual, but there was something off about it. Too deliberate, too calm. Why aren't you picking up? I know you're home. I saw you carry those bags in. Don't be rude. My throat went dry. My curtains were drawn, but I felt exposed, like he could see through them. I immediately called the police and tried to explain, but they didn't seem to think it was urgent. Probably just a prank, the operator said. They told me to lock my doors and call back if anything escalated. Escalated? That word stuck in my head as I double-checked every lock in the house, heart pounding. About an hour later, just as I was starting to calm down, my doorbell rang. I froze. No one rings my bell at night without texting first. Not my friends, not even delivery drivers. I tiptoed to the peephole, and my stomach churned. There was a man standing there, tall, wearing a dark hoodie. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I recognized the shape of him from earlier at the mall. He'd been leaning against a pillar near the food court while I was waiting in line for coffee. My brain scrambled to piece it together. Was this guy seriously following me? I backed away from the door as quietly as I could, clutching my phone, and dialed 911. The dispatcher stayed on the line while I whispered what was happening, my voice trembling so much I could barely get the words out. She told me to stay on the line, stay calm, and stay out of sight. But then the man knocked, 3 slow, deliberate taps. It wasn't frantic or aggressive, just deliberate, like he was trying to prove something. My breath caught in my throat as he leaned closer to the door, and I heard him mumble something I couldn't make out. The dispatcher was asking if I had a weapon or a safe place to hide, but my mind was blank. All I could do was crouch behind the couch and watch the door like it was about to explode. The knocking stopped, but the silence was worse. I couldn't hear his footsteps, couldn't tell if he'd left or was still outside. The dispatcher said officers were on their way, but it felt like hours. Suddenly, I heard a faint scraping sound at the back of the house, near the sliding door to my patio. My heart was racing so fast I thought I might pass out. I inched toward the hallway, keeping low, and peeked around the corner. That's when I saw his silhouette through the curtains. He was trying to open the door. I whispered this to the dispatcher, and she told me to lock myself in a room. I ran upstairs as quietly as I could, locking myself in the bathroom and pressing my ear to the door. As I sat on the cold tile floor of the bathroom, every creak of the house felt like it was him, already inside. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and ragged, and I tried to keep it quiet. The dispatcher was speaking softly, assuring me that officers were close, but I barely registered her words. Then I heard it, a faint thud from downstairs, like something heavy had hit the floor. My mind raced. Did he break in? Was he already in the house? I grabbed the closest thing I could find, a ceramic lid from the back of the toilet. It wasn't much, but in that moment, it felt like my only lifeline. Minutes dragged by, each second feeling like an hour, until I finally heard the sound of sirens. Relief washed over me, but it was mixed with dread. What if they were too late? I stayed frozen in the bathroom until I heard the unmistakable sound of someone pounding on my front door, shouting, "Police." I opened the bathroom door just a crack and listened, trying to make sure it was really them. After what felt like an eternity, the dispatcher confirmed it for me. The officers were inside. I rushed downstairs, but my legs felt like jelly. By the time I got to the living room, the man was already in handcuffs. He was staring straight at me with this blank expression, like he wasn't scared, wasn't angry, just empty. The officers asked me a million questions, but I could barely form coherent answers. All I kept saying was, "He was at the mall, and then he was here." They found tools in his pockets, a knife, zip ties, and some duct tape. My stomach turned when I saw it laid out on the coffee table, like evidence from some true crime show. They told me he hadn't said much after they arrested him, only that he wanted to see me. One of the officers tried to reassure me, saying I'd done the right thing by calling, but I could see in their faces that they were shaken too. When they searched his car, parked a few houses down, they found more supplies, rope, gloves, and a roll of black trash bags. I felt like I was going to throw up. After the officers left, I sat in my living room in total silence, unable to process what had just happened. The dispatcher had suggested I stay somewhere else for the night, but I didn't have anywhere to go on such short notice. Instead, I locked every window and door again and dragged a heavy chair in front of the front door. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow felt like it was moving. The worst part was that I kept replaying the day in my head over and over, wondering if I had missed any signs earlier. How long had he been following me? Was it just today, or had this been going on longer? Those questions still haunt me. The next morning, I got a call from the police. They told me the man had a record, several arrests for stalking and harassment. They didn't give me many details, just enough to confirm that this wasn't the first time he'd done something like this. They said he'd likely targeted me at random, maybe after seeing me at the mall, but they couldn't be sure. The idea that I was just picked sent chills through me. What if I hadn't locked my doors? What if I'd ignored the calls completely and stayed downstairs instead of hiding? The what-ifs have been a constant loop in my head ever since. It's been a few weeks now, and I still don't feel safe. Every time I'm out, I find myself scanning crowds, looking over my shoulder, wondering if someone's watching me. I've changed my routine, parked in different spots, and even installed cameras around my house, but nothing really helps. The worst part is, even though he's in custody, I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, lurking in the shadows. That blank stare he gave me when they put him in the squad car, it's burned into my mind. It's like he wasn't afraid of getting caught, like he knew something I didn't. I don't think I'll ever feel normal again. The man in the backyard during a family gathering. I've always loved Christmas with my family. We're the kind of people who go all out, twinkling lights everywhere, a massive tree covered in mismatched ornaments, and enough food to feed an army. That year, we were celebrating at my parents' house, a cozy place tucked into the woods at the edge of town. It was one of those perfect evenings, with the smell of roasted ham and cinnamon filling the air, and everyone laughing and reminiscing in the living room. For context, I'm in my late 20s, married, and I was juggling a plate of cookies and a toddler at the time, trying not to spill crumbs on my mom's pristine rug. Everything felt so warm and normal, until my cousin Jared came back inside from grabbing something from his car. He looked off. His face was pale, his usual goofy grin replaced with a tight frown. When I asked him what was wrong, he just shook his head, muttering, "I thought I saw someone out there. Near the trees." He motioned toward the backyard, where the towering pines loomed, their branches dusted with snow. It didn't seem like a big deal at first. Maybe a neighbor passing by or a deer. But something in his voice stuck with me, like a splinter under my skin. I couldn't shake the unease, so a few minutes later, I wandered over to the sliding glass door that looked out into the backyard. It was dark, save for the soft glow of the fairy lights strung up along the deck. At first, I didn't see anything, just the black outline of the tree line against the snowy ground. But then, near the edge of the trees, I caught a flicker of movement. My heart skipped. It was faint, like someone stepping just far enough into the shadows to disappear. I blinked, leaning closer to the glass. Do you see something? Jared had followed me, his voice low. I hesitated before answering. I don't know. Maybe. We both stood there for a few more minutes, but nothing happened. No more movement. No sound. I laughed it off, feeling a little foolish. Probably just the wind, I said, though my chest felt tight. Jared didn't look convinced, but he shrugged and went back to join the others. I lingered a moment longer, my eyes tracing the dark line of trees. The night carried on, and I tried to forget about it. Everyone was in high spirits. Drinks were flowing, the kids were tearing into presents, and my dad was telling one of his long-winded stories by the fire. But every so often, I'd catch myself glancing toward the sliding door. It felt irrational, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there, just beyond the reach of the light. Around 10 p.m., most of the kids had fallen asleep on the couches, and a few family members had started heading home. I decided to step outside for a breather before helping clean up. The cold air bit at my skin as I stepped onto the deck. My breath came out in small puffs, and the snow crunched softly under my boots. It was quiet, eerily quiet. The kind of silence that feels like it's holding its breath. That's when I saw them. Footprints. They started at the edge of the yard, near the tree line, and led straight toward the deck. My stomach churned as I stared at them, fresh and perfectly spaced, like someone had walked deliberately toward the house. I scanned the area, half expecting to see someone standing there, but the yard was empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I backed inside quickly, locking the door behind me. My hands were trembling, but I didn't want to freak anyone out just yet. It's probably nothing, I told myself. Still, I found Jared and pulled him aside. There are footprints in the backyard, I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. His eyes widened, and he followed me to the door. We both stood there, staring at the tracks. They were impossible to miss against the fresh snow, leading from the woods straight to the deck. "What the hell?" Jared muttered, and for once, his usual bravado was gone. Without thinking, he unlocked the door and stepped out. "Wait," I hissed, but he was already moving, his boots crunching over the snow. He followed the tracks to the edge of the deck, peering into the darkness of the yard. I stayed inside, my heart pounding in my chest. "Do you see anything?" I called out through the glass, my voice barely more than a whisper. He shook his head, stepping back toward the house. "No, but—" "I don't like this," he said when he came back in, shutting the door firmly behind him. We decided not to tell the rest of the family right away. It felt ridiculous, like we were overreacting to nothing, but neither of us could ignore how strange it was. Jared and I kept glancing at each other across the room as the night went on, both of us on edge. Around midnight, most of the guests had left, leaving just my parents, my siblings, and a couple of cousins. Everyone else had settled into that comfortable post-Christmas haze, the kind where you're too full and too tired to do much more than sit around and chat. That's when my mom asked me to take some trash out to the bin by the side of the house. I didn't want to, not after what I'd seen, but I didn't want to explain why either. So, I grabbed the bags and headed out. The night felt even colder now, and the silence was suffocating. I kept my eyes trained on the snow as I walked, trying not to look at the woods. But then I heard it, a faint rustling, like someone shifting their weight on frozen ground. My blood turned to ice, and I froze mid-step. The sound came again, closer this time. Slowly, I turned toward the trees. At first, I didn't see anything, just the dark mass of trees against the faint glow of the moonlight. But then, as my eyes adjusted, I saw him. A man. He was standing perfectly still at the edge of the tree line, half shrouded in shadow. He wasn't close enough for me to make out details, but I could tell he was tall, with broad shoulders and something unsettlingly rigid about his posture. He wasn't dressed for the weather. No coat or hat, just what looked like a thin shirt and pants. My throat tightened as I realized he wasn't moving. He was just watching. I dropped the trash bag without thinking and stumbled back toward the house, my heart hammering in my chest. The moment I reached the door, I locked it and pulled the curtain shut. Jared saw my face and jumped up. "What is it?" "What did you see?" he asked, his voice low but urgent. "He's out there," I whispered, barely able to get the words out. "A man. He's just standing there." Jared grabbed a flashlight and started toward the door, but I stopped him, grabbing his arm. "Don't." "He's not normal," I said, my voice cracking. "Something's wrong with him." Jared hesitated, his hand hovering over the flashlight switch. I could tell he wanted to go out there, to prove it was just some random guy passing through, but my panic must have shaken him. "All right," he muttered, stepping back from the door. "We'll keep it locked. But if he's still out there in the morning, we're calling someone." His calm tone did little to ease the gnawing fear in my chest. I peeked through the curtain again, but the man was gone. Only the snow and shadows stared back at me. The rest of the night was a blur of restless anxiety. I barely slept, jolting awake at every sound, convinced he was back. Around 3 a.m., I heard soft creaks from the floorboards near the back door. At first, I thought it was just my parents' old house settling, but then I heard a soft thud. My heart raced as I crept into the living room. The curtains over the sliding door were drawn, but I could see the faint glow of the porch light filtering through the edges. My hand trembled as I reached for the curtain. When I pulled it back, my breath caught. There, on the freshly fallen snow just outside the sliding door, were footprints. Not just one set, several. They crisscrossed the deck, leading right up to the glass. My eyes darted to the footprints' path, which trailed back toward the tree line, but no one was there. The sheer number of prints made my stomach drop. It wasn't like someone had just walked up once and left. Whoever it was had been pacing, circling, lingering. My knees felt weak, and I stumbled back, bumping into Jared, who had quietly followed me. His face paled when he saw the prints. "That's not possible," he muttered, his voice shaking. "We locked the door. We didn't hear anything." But the prints didn't care about logic. They were right there, as clear as day. Jared grabbed a bat from the hall closet and marched toward the door. "Wait. What are you doing?" I hissed, but he didn't stop. He flipped the lock and slid the door open just enough to step onto the deck. I was too scared to move, frozen in the doorway as he scanned the yard with the flashlight. "Hello," he called out into the cold, his breath puffing in the air. The beam of light swung over the trees, the snow, the footprints, but no one answered. Jared stood there for what felt like an eternity, his flashlight slicing through the stillness. I wanted to drag him back inside, but fear kept me rooted in place. Finally, he stepped back into the house and locked the door. "Whoever it was, they're gone now," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. We both knew it didn't make sense. There was no way someone could have walked away that quickly without us hearing or seeing them. The rest of the night dragged on. Jared and I took turns keeping watch near the sliding door, but nothing else happened. By morning, the footprints were still there, stark against the snow, but the man was nowhere to be found. We debated calling the police, but what could we say? Someone might have been lurking in our yard. Didn't feel like much of a case. My mom dismissed the whole thing as some drunk passing through, but the unease stayed with me. The next few days were tense. Jared and I couldn't stop thinking about the man and the footprints. My parents tried to brush it off, but my dad eventually caved and checked the security camera they'd installed on the deck a few months ago. It was an old system, grainy footage and no audio, but it should have caught something. Instead, it raised more questions. The footage showed the snow undisturbed for hours, right up until just before I pulled back the curtain. Then, the footprints just appeared. No man, No motion, nothing. One frame, the snow was pristine. The next, it was covered in those tracks. My dad chalked it up to a glitch, but Jared and I knew better. Something about it felt wrong, impossible. A week later, my parents found another set of prints, this time leading from the woods to their back door, just like before. They never saw the man again, but those footprints appeared twice more that winter, always after a fresh snowfall. My parents eventually replaced the security camera and added extra locks, but I don't think they ever felt completely safe in that house again. As for me, I haven't been back since. Stranded on the roof by a mysterious intruder. I never thought putting up Christmas lights could turn into the most terrifying night of my life. It was just last week, a cold, clear evening, and I was out on the roof trying to finish the decorations before it got too dark. The street was quiet, with most of my neighbors either inside their houses or still at work. I had Christmas music playing faintly from a Bluetooth speaker on the window ledge, and everything seemed peaceful. I remember thinking about how good the lights were going to look this year. I had bought those synchronized ones that blinked to music. But then, out of nowhere, I heard it. A dull thud behind me, the unmistakable sound of the ladder hitting the ground. At first, I thought it had just tipped over on its own. I turned around, slightly annoyed, thinking I'd have to climb down some other way or shout for my wife to come help. But as I looked down, my stomach dropped. There was someone standing there, dressed in dark clothes, his face hidden by a hood. He was staring up at me for a moment before he moved toward the back of the house and out of my sight. I froze. It wasn't just that someone had knocked over the ladder, it was how deliberate it had seemed, like they wanted me to stay on the roof. My heart started racing as I tried to figure out what to do. I immediately grabbed my phone from my pocket, but of course, I'd left it inside. Stupid, right? I kept telling myself it was fine. Maybe it was a neighbor pulling a prank or someone who'd gotten the wrong house. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. I shuffled toward the edge of the roof, keeping low so I wouldn't be too visible. From my angle, I could see the backyard, but whoever it was had already disappeared inside the house. The door leading to the kitchen was wide open. I could see the glow from the hallway light spilling out onto the grass, and the realization hit me. Whoever it was had just let themselves in. Panic took over. My wife wasn't home. She'd gone to pick up some groceries, and I wasn't expecting her back for another hour. I thought about yelling for help, but what if he heard me? What if he came back outside? My thoughts were racing, and my breathing felt too loud, like it might give me away. I crouched there, staring at the open door, hoping, praying that he would just leave. But minutes passed, and nothing happened. No movement, no noise from inside. It was the silence that was the worst, like the house itself was holding its breath. I sat there on the roof, my hands shaking so badly I almost lost my grip on the shingles. My mind kept cycling through the possibilities. Was he robbing the place? Was this some psycho looking to hurt someone? I tried to convince myself that he'd take whatever he came for and leave, but then I remembered. The lights were on, the car was in the driveway. He had to think someone was home. And yet, he went in anyway. That thought chilled me to the bone. It wasn't about stealing. Whoever this was, they weren't scared of being caught. Minutes felt like hours as I strained to hear anything. Footsteps, doors creaking, anything at all. Finally, I heard it, a faint sound coming from the upstairs hallway, where our bedroom was. I couldn't see anything from my angle, but just knowing he was up there, walking around like he owned the place, made me feel helpless. I clenched my fists, trying to figure out what to do. Jumping off the roof wasn't an option. It was too high, and I'd probably break a leg. My only hope was to stay put and wait for him to leave. But what if he didn't? What if he was still inside when my wife got home? I don't know how much time passed, but eventually, I saw movement again. From my spot on the roof, I had a clear view of the front door. The guy stepped out, casually, like he had every right to be there. He didn't have anything in his hands. No TV, no laptop, nothing. He just stood there for a second, looking around, and then he turned his head up toward me. My blood ran cold. Even though I couldn't see his face clearly under the hood, I knew he was looking right at me. It wasn't just a glance. It was like he'd known I was up there the whole time. I didn't move, didn't even breathe. For a second, I thought he might come back for the ladder and try to get up there, but instead, he just turned and started walking down the driveway, disappearing into the night. I stayed frozen, staring after him long after he was gone, trying to make sense of what just happened. Why had he gone inside? Why hadn't he taken anything? And why the hell did he look at me like that, like he wanted me to know he'd seen me? Even after he was gone, I couldn't bring myself to climb down. My legs felt like jelly, and the idea of going back into the house alone made my stomach churn. I kept scanning the street, half expecting him to come back, but it was dead silent. I finally worked up the nerve to peek into the backyard again, hoping the ladder was still there. It wasn't. He'd taken it with him. My only way down now was to wait for my wife to get home. I sat there on the roof, shivering in the cold, the Christmas lights around me blinking cheerfully like nothing had happened. When I finally heard the sound of the car pulling into the driveway, I almost cried from relief. I waved my arms to get her attention, and she jumped out of the car, looking up at me like I'd lost my mind. "What are you doing up there?" she called. I didn't even know how to begin explaining. She brought out a step stool from the garage so I could climb down, and as soon as my feet hit the ground, I practically dragged her back into the car. "We're not staying here tonight," I told her. She didn't argue, but the look on her face told me she thought I was overreacting. We spent the night at her parents' house, and I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured that guy staring up at me from the driveway. The next morning, we went back to the house, and I felt a knot in my stomach the moment we pulled into the driveway. Nothing seemed out of place. The front door was locked, and all the windows were shut. It was almost like I'd imagined the whole thing. But when we went inside, there were little signs that proved I hadn't. A few drawers in the kitchen were left open. A chair in the living room had been moved slightly, just enough to make it noticeable. And upstairs, in our bedroom, my closet door was ajar. That closet door was what really freaked me out. I never leave it open, ever. I stood there staring at it, trying to work up the courage to look inside. My wife was behind me, asking what was wrong, but I couldn't answer. When I finally swung the door open, there was nothing there, just my clothes and a few boxes on the floor. But the idea that someone had been in my house, rummaging through my things while I was trapped on the roof, was too much. I told my wife everything then, about the ladder, the guy, and the way he'd looked at me. She wanted to call the cops, but I wasn't even sure what to tell them. He hadn't taken anything. He hadn't even done anything, at least, not that I could prove. We called the police anyway, just in case. When they arrived, I told them everything I could remember. The guy's height, the dark clothes, the hood. They walked through the house, checking all the locks and windows, but there wasn't much they could do. There were no signs of forced entry, and nothing was missing. The officer I spoke to kept asking if I was sure it wasn't just a neighbor or a delivery person who got confused. I could tell he didn't believe me, especially when I mentioned the ladder being knocked over. He just gave me that look, like he thought I was making it up or overreacting. Before they left, they promised to patrol the area, but it felt like a hollow reassurance. For the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching me. Every creak in the house made my skin crawl, and I avoided going outside alone. Then, one night, I found the ladder. It was propped up neatly against the side of the house, like it had never been missing. My stomach turned when I saw it, and I couldn't bring myself to touch it. I told my wife, but she just shrugged it off. "Maybe he brought it back," she said, trying to lighten the mood. But the way she said it, half joking, half concerned, only made me feel worse. I knew she didn't really believe it, but I also knew I wasn't imagining things. Someone had been there, and now they'd come back. After finding the ladder, I couldn't sleep. I started waking up in the middle of the night to check the locks, wandering through the house with a flashlight like I was guarding something. A few nights later, I heard something outside, soft, almost rhythmic, like footsteps on gravel. My heart pounded as I crept to the window, careful not to make a sound. When I peeked outside, there was no one there. But the sound kept coming. I realized it wasn't coming from the driveway. It was from above me. Someone was on the roof. I froze, the flashlight trembling in my hand. I wanted to run, to wake my wife, but I couldn't move. The footsteps stopped, and for a long, agonizing moment, there was silence. Then, a single sharp knock echoed from the ceiling. 3 taps, deliberate and loud enough to make my breath catch. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I grabbed my wife and bolted for the car, not bothering to grab anything else. We drove straight to a motel and stayed there the rest of the night. We haven't been back to the house since. Attempted break-in on Christmas Eve. It was Christmas Eve, and for the first time in my life, I was spending it alone. My parents were visiting my grandparents upstate, but I had to stay behind for work. Honestly, I didn't mind at first. I thought it would be kind of nice to have some quiet time. The house felt too big without them, though, especially with all the holiday decorations still up. It was one of those older houses with creaky wooden floors and tall windows that let in just enough light to make the shadows feel alive. I was curled up on the couch, binge-watching Christmas movies, trying to drown out the eerie silence. Around 10 p.m., I thought I heard something outside, like the sound of crunching snow, but I brushed it off, telling myself it was probably a raccoon or some other animal. Then, a loud knock came at the front door. It wasn't the kind of knock you'd expect from a neighbor dropping off cookies or carolers spreading holiday cheer. It was slow, deliberate, and heavy, like someone was testing the door's strength. My heart sank, and I froze, the remote still in my hand. Who could it be this late at night? I tiptoed to the window beside the door, careful to stay hidden behind the curtain, and peeked out. There were 3 men standing on the porch, dressed in dark clothes. None of them looked familiar. One of them had his face turned toward the door, a smirk plastered across his face, while the others whispered to each other and glanced around nervously. I didn't know what to do. My parents had always warned me about opening the door to strangers, but I didn't want to draw attention by calling out or making noise. I backed away from the window, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped the remote. My first instinct was to call the police, but then I thought maybe I was overreacting. Maybe they were lost or needed help. Before I could decide, another sound made my stomach drop. Someone was trying the doorknob. It rattled hard, and then there was a loud thud, like they were testing the door with their shoulder. Panic surged through me, and I sprinted for my phone on the kitchen counter. I kept the lights off, moving as quietly as I could. My hands were trembling so much that I struggled to unlock the screen. As I dialed 911, I heard one of them say something through the door, muffled but aggressive, like they were talking to each other about getting inside. My heart was pounding so loudly I thought it would give me away. The operator answered, and I whispered, trying not to let my voice carry. I told her 3 men were outside, trying to break in, and she assured me help was on the way. But then came another sound that made my blood run cold, glass shattering from the side of the house. They weren't going to wait for the door to give in. They were coming in through the living room window. I felt like I was moving on autopilot at that point. I grabbed the biggest knife I could find from the kitchen and ducked into the hallway, trying to stay hidden. My breath was shallow, and I could barely hear anything over the rush of blood in my ears. The sound of boots crunching on broken glass echoed through the house, and I knew at least one of them was inside. I wanted to scream, to do anything to scare them off, but I couldn't risk making a noise. Every instinct I had was telling me to stay as quiet as possible. From my hiding spot near the staircase, I caught a glimpse of one of them walking through the living room. He was tall, wearing a ski mask and holding what looked like a crowbar. He moved slowly, scanning the room like he was searching for something, or someone. My hands tightened around the knife, but I knew I was no match for them if it came to that. The operator was still on the line, whispering updates to me. "Officers are on their way. Stay on the phone," she said. I wanted to believe her, but every second felt like an hour, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could stay hidden. I heard another voice, this one coming from outside. "Anything yet?" one of the men called out, his tone impatient and angry. The guy in the living room didn't answer, just kept moving further into the house. That's when I heard the unmistakable sound of a second window breaking, this time from the kitchen. My heart sank. I realized they were splitting up. I pressed myself tighter into the shadows of the hallway, trying to make myself invisible. Every creak of the floor, every shift of the house felt amplified in the suffocating silence. My eyes darted to the stairs. My bedroom was up there, with a lock on the door. Maybe if I could just make it upstairs, I'd have a better chance of holding them off until the police arrived. I gripped the knife so hard my fingers ached, and I slowly began moving toward the staircase. That's when I heard it, a faint click, like someone trying the doorknob to the basement door behind me. I froze. The house only had one basement entrance, and it was always locked. How did they even know it was there? My stomach turned as the realization hit me. They weren't just trying to rob the house, they knew the layout. I didn't have time to think. The basement door rattled again, harder this time, and then I heard footsteps coming toward the stairs, heavy and deliberate. They were closing in on me. My legs felt like jelly, but somehow I managed to scramble up the staircase, taking the steps two at a time. The wooden stairs groaned under my weight, and I knew they had to hear me, but I didn't care. All I could think about was getting to my room and locking the door. As I reached the top, I heard one of them shout, "Hey!" upstairs, followed by the sound of someone running after me. I darted into my room, slamming the door shut and locking it just as the footsteps reached the top of the stairs. I shoved my dresser against the door, my adrenaline giving me strength I didn't know I had. Then I grabbed my phone again, whispering frantically to the operator. "They're in the house. Upstairs. Please, please hurry." She reassured me that officers were minutes away, but that didn't feel like enough. The door rattled violently as one of them tried to force it open. I backed away, holding the knife in front of me, my entire body trembling. The only thought running through my head was, what if they break through before help gets here? The pounding on the door grew louder, each hit making the dresser shift slightly. My eyes darted around the room, looking for anything else I could use to block the door or defend myself. There wasn't much, just a lamp, some books, and a few other things that wouldn't make a difference. Then I heard another voice outside, deeper and more agitated. "Hurry it up," one of the men barked. It was clear they didn't plan on leaving without getting inside that room. I could feel tears welling up, but I forced myself to stay quiet, biting my lip to stop from sobbing. Suddenly, something changed. The sound of sirens echoed faintly in the distance, growing louder with every passing second. The pounding stopped abruptly, followed by hurried footsteps retreating down the hallway. I stayed frozen, barely daring to breathe. Then, from the window, I saw them. Two of the men bolting through the backyard, stumbling over the snow, while the third one lingered just long enough to grab something from his coat pocket. He turned back toward the house and pointed at my window. I don't know if it was instinct or pure terror, but I dropped to the floor just as a loud crack rang out. Something shattered above me, my bedroom window. The sound of glass spraying across the room was deafening. I covered my head, trying to make myself as small as possible. I didn't know if it was a rock, a bullet, or something else, but it didn't matter. I wasn't taking any chances. My entire body was trembling, and I stayed flat on the floor, barely daring to peek out. The sirens were blaring now, impossibly close, and through the broken window, I could see red and blue lights flashing against the snow-covered trees outside. Relief washed over me, but it was quickly overshadowed by dread. What if the men tried to make a stand? What if they were armed? I heard shouting from outside, commands I couldn't quite make out, but it was enough to know the police had arrived. The pounding of boots on the porch and in the yard was almost as loud as my heartbeat. I stayed where I was, too terrified to move, even when I heard the front door being kicked in. Minutes felt like hours before a voice finally called out, "Police. Is anyone here?" I hesitated, my throat so dry I could barely respond. "Upstairs," I croaked, still gripping the knife as if it would do any good now. When an officer finally reached my room, his flashlight cutting through the darkness, I almost collapsed in relief. The officer pushed the door open slowly, his flashlight sweeping the room before he stepped inside. "You're safe now," he said, his voice calm but firm. I couldn't speak. All I could do was nod as he helped me to my feet. My legs felt like they might give out, but the sight of other officers moving through the house, guns drawn and voices steady, gave me some sense of security. They cleared the house quickly, confirming the men were gone. Outside, I could see more officers combing the yard and the street, their cars creating a blinding halo of lights against the snow. One of the officers told me they had found fresh footprints leading into the woods behind my house. They hadn't caught the men yet, but the police were confident they'd track them down soon. Still, that wasn't the part that stayed with me. As they escorted me outside to sit in one of the cruisers, I glanced back at the house. Through the shattered window of my room, I could see the dark outline of something lodged in the wall opposite where I had been standing. Later, I found out it was a bullet. If I hadn't dropped to the floor when I did, I wouldn't be here to tell this story. Even now, weeks later, I can't shake the feeling that they'll come back. The police say it's unlikely. They think the sirens scared them off for good. But every creak in the house, every shadow outside the window, sends my heart racing. Christmas Eve used to be my favorite night of the year. Now, I can't think about it without hearing the sound of glass breaking or feeling the weight of that silence before the chaos began.